In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to It's Not Just in Your Head, a podcast about capitalism and mental health, or another way to put it is how the economic and political and social world impacts our relationships and emotional lives. We are two therapists. I am Max Golding, LMFT. We have Dr. Harriet Fraud, PhD. Hello, Harriet.
Hello. Glad to be here.
And today we have a guest who I'm like glowing personally with, like, she's like my hero because her book is one of my favorite books in the world. Her name is Jennifer Silva. And I'm like so excited I might not even speak like coherently. But so Jennifer Silva, so she joined the O'Neill School, which is where she currently is an assistant professor in 2019. And her research interests have included political culture, social class, inequality, transitions to adulthood, qualitative methods, and family and intimate life. She previously taught sociology at Bucknell University. She was also a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, where she studied the impact of economic insecurity on social connectedness and civil engagement. She's written some books. One is We're Still Here, Pain and Politics in the Heart of America. And the one that I've read and Harriet's read, Coming Up Short, Working Class Adulthood in an Age of Uncertainty. And anyone who is like a sort of, if you're like an addict of the podcast and you've like listened to all of them, I did a solo one that was like really centered around her book, like maybe a couple months ago, and how it kind of, I shared some personal things because I'm kind of like, I'm a millennial, and I realize it applied to me so much. So there's that. So we might get into that as we talk, but and that's why I'm just very excited about this, because I think it, for my generation and for me, your work, Jennifer, really speaks to us. So, and in any case, Harriet and I were both really blown away by Coming Up Short. I think because you seem to like discover something, or you were pointing to something that I don't think is like popularly understood or talked about a whole lot. And it was that there was this enormous shift in like consciousness, priorities, culture, a whole mindset for millennials, working class millennials, as compared with their parents' generation. So what were some of those main differences that you found between the younger adult working class generation and their parents' generation?
That's a great question. And also thank you for having me today. And I'm very honored by all of your kind words. I started this book as an exploration of how young and working class Americans, which I describe as people who don't have a four-year college, or whose parents didn't have a four-year college degree, so they grew up in these working class homes. I wanted to understand how they approached the transition to adulthood, because there's a large literature that shows that, young people today are not growing up the way they used to. They're not like, at 18, it's not like you move out and get a job or, finish school in 4 years and then get married and have children and buy the house. That's not happening. People are either staying with their parents or going back and forth. Sometimes you're having kids outside of marriage or leaving relationships, and work is not this stable institution anymore. So they might be bouncing around. And I was like, well, how do they make sense of that? If how do you grow up if you can't hit any of those traditional markers? And so actually what happened to me is I decided to go do interviews with young people. And I thought they were going to talk about like politics more. I thought they'd say, we're so angry about the big banks and the recession that have, or we're so angry about, the rising costs of, state tuition. And they they maybe said that like for a sentence or two. And then they just wanted to tell me their own story about, they want to talk about growing up. They wanted to talk about the really painful pasts they often had. They wanted to basically talk about addiction or fighting mental illness or, having a difficult family relationship or romantic relationship that didn't work out and kind of which they saw as the reason why they were stuck, why they weren't able to, quote unquote, grow up. And so for them, it really wasn't a story of trying to meet the traditional markers, but it was more about how to heal themselves, right? How to deal with this difficult past, how to figure out how to move on. And they really defined growth not as age or markers, but like psychic and emotional development. So like I figured out how to treat my own, addiction, and I realized that I can't depend on anyone and I have to take care of myself. And that actually was how they then defined adulthood and being a good person. And I actually had no idea what to do with this when I was hearing it in the interviews, because it wasn't what I was expecting. And I was like, okay. And so then I sort of switched literatures and started trying to figure out what was going on, and started realizing this might be, a cultural narrative, the therapeutic narrative that, we've grown up with as millennials, about kind of finding problems in your past that explain why you are where you are today, and then learning how to grow personally and transform yourself.
Wow.
Well, I wonder how you see the transition from the generation of, let's say, the 60s and 70s, which grew up in a politicized world, seeing that racism and a war culture and capitalism held people back, to blaming oneself and looking only inside at the problems rather than inside and outside in our declining empire. What happened?
I've thought about this a lot, and it was something I revisited working with Robert Putnam, who talks about the collapse of civil society, and then also in my second book, which is more about politics. But the way I would explain it is, and I would add unions to your list, so people were joined unions, they were part of unions, and also things like churches, all of these more external facing institutions where people would come together and maybe offer support and, collective action, but also provide a forum for understanding that your problems are not all created by you. And
it's not just in your head.
Yeah, it's not just in your head. Yeah.
Right.
But the people I talked with, they didn't really have any of those institutions. And instead, it seemed like they actually found that institutions were more like sources of betrayal for them. Education or, religion or military, they all sort of had stories of feeling like they believed in the institution and it failed them, which I think they did. And so for them, it was like, they basically learned the hard way. They say that if you depend on other people, you're only going to be hurt in the end. This often goes back to early childhood trauma too. And so it's they just decide that it's almost shameful to rely on other people. So it's like a virtue. It's virtuous to not ask for help, virtuous to not join others. And instead you have to survive on your own.
It's like neoliberalism just internalized into a whole generation or something. Anyway, that's a little bit too editorial, I guess.
I like it.
But it's so mind blowing. I just another tangential editorial is that it's mind blowing because for me growing up as this millennial, where when I was reading your book and I was reading the sort of the way you'd bring all these contextual things and statistics and history along with the narratives, I realized I am all these people. I am of this exact generation and I have the same story and I have the same narrative. And most people I know that are around my age seem to have something really similar or the same. And then I realized, well, I don't think any of us know that this is a sort of collective phenomenon because it's so individualized. As you sort of found, it seems like no one you interviewed was well, I know everyone else is like this too. It was more here's my individual story, right? Does that seem accurate that everyone seemed
that's
almost...
absolutely true. I mean, I think most of us probably don't think about the self as a story we learn to tell about ourselves, right? It's more you experience it as something that's very fixed and very personal to you, and probably also something immutable. But then it's sort of interesting to think about, we're all kind of telling a pattern story that we've learned. And I think that also it's very powerful to realize that, because if you realize that, you can also think about it in different ways. Like, how might you want to change the narrative? Or what if you think about different causes, which I think probably is something maybe as psychiatrists you also probably do with people, like thinking about those stories.
It makes me wonder, though, how the transition is made, because, of course, this is a very convenient narrative for the perpetuation of capitalism and our declining empire. And I do remember that my cousins who were older than I, who lived and were like 6 to 9 years old during World War II, used to gather the other kids together and go into a shelter and support one another. And there was a sense of America that was unified and was hopeful. And what I'm struck by is that for those generations following World War II, since the other superpowers were all destroyed besides us, and we were very prosperous and people's possibilities were numerous and unions were strong, even people in dysfunctional families had hope and ambition. And that I'd like to understand the relationship between this declining empire of capitalist predation and individualism that you describe. How do you see the relationship? They're growing up in such an unhopeful America, which is declining, but they're going inside.
I think it's largely because they don't know where to go outside in a way, and I'm thinking about my latest book too, where I talked about politics, and people really understood that the kind of system was created against them. They talk a lot about the collusion of big business and politicians, and they talk about the way that they'd be very enlightened, right, about how capitalists really benefit from them, from like racial strife among the working class, and they kind of were aware of all of this, but then I don't know if they had a way to imagine connecting with other people about it, because it's like the end result was to sort of choose distrust and isolation as these markers of being a smart person. And so you're right, though, like the economic sphere and the cultural sphere really work together, right? If you believe you have to make it on your own, that's like, of course, very beneficial to capitalists. And of course, there is this whole huge consumer market that has developed in the time that you were mentioning, from World War II, about, there's self-help, things like power of positive thinking, and like you can spend so much money on, wellness as an industry. So I think that's part of it too.
Well, I wonder too. So I've been feeling kind of bad because when I first hooked into this idea from your book, I was thinking, well, man, we've been really kind of like bamboozled. This is a bunch of bullshit, therapy, self-help. And I was like, how did I end up becoming a therapist? Like I was bullshitted into this, right?
No.
It's a bunch of bullshit. No, I know. But on the other side, I was sort of pendulumed there because I was like, wait a minute, why is it like, because the episode I did a few episodes ago, it was like a critique of TikTok therapy. And it was my partner and I were just talking about how like there is, not only for like the millennial generation, but even kind of Zoomer, like younger now, it's like everyone knows all the language, like narcissism and BPD. They know all the diagnostic terms and stuff. Like there are people who are like 10 years younger than me. I'm like almost 37 now, who like seem to know therapeutic jargon better than I do. And I'm like a trained therapist now, right? So at a certain point I was thinking like, well, wait a minute, how is like everybody that's like 20 years old or 25 or 30 or whatever, like an expert in like psychology, but like doesn't know how anything in like this sort of socio-political realm works, or like never like couldn't explain to you like, I don't know, Marxist, not that everybody needs to be a Marxist, but like Marxist theory, like to explain like what the sort of political economy is that we're kind of swimming in. Like it's like a bizarre thing. So I felt, well, how did all this bullshit happen? But then I went to this other side when you said, and maybe this is your more recent book, which I have zero familiarity with. When you did that Jacobin interview, you said something like that you think that this generation is going to need a politics around like collective pain or something like that, because all of this individualized narrative is like how much pain, right? Like like my trauma, my childhood trauma, my broken family, I'm dysfunctional. I need to go see a therapist. like, it's almost like the message I was getting from you is that you were just saying like, well, this is the reality of the generation now, right? So we can't just say like, no, get past it. We need to like work collectively. It's like, there must be something valid and like real and significant about that pain. So could you elaborate on, is that right? So you said something like that?
That's so true. And, it's also like me sort of becoming more mature and more maybe thoughtful, for my dissertation to like also going through the transition to adulthood and thinking more about this. But I would say, I think there's enormous emancipatory potential in this idea that you can know yourself and you can tell your story. And I think, if you think about like working class of previous generations where maybe they did a lot of suffering in silence, women, you may be trapped in marriages or, just people feeling unfulfilled, but, being more stoic about it or, being more into more traditional gender roles and identity or religion. And I think that we can't like forget that there's so much more freedom available to define, the scope of your life today. And I think that's really important. And I think that we sort of have to work with that because we don't want to kind of go back into these stable roles either, because they weren't good for people and they never were available to many people of color and poor people as well.
If, I'm thinking of the rash of strike activities and even solidarity that people have now, in that several unions are getting together and other unions are supporting the Frito-Lay strike and the Frito-Lay workers are supporting other workers. Do you think it's because people recognize that their economic and political lives are adding to their pain? Or
I do believe that. I do. So I would say, especially in my last book, I did hear people talk about a lot of personal pain and trauma, but they were also able to talk about, things like housing markets and, the rising cost of education and extremely low wages and, abusive workers. And I also saw some embracing of Black Lives Matter as well, and actually some collective action. And so I do think that. I mean, I think also maybe the 2016 election cycle maybe made people more aware and conscious of this.
Yeah. Well, and you did, this is maybe just forgive our ignorance since we're familiar with Coming Up Short, but not your last The Pain in Politics one. But like, because you had written Coming Up Short before, I wonder what would have happened if you did the same exact interviews in like 2018, right?
Yes.
I know, right? I do too.
Because maybe, like post-burn, I mean, because there is a totally shifting narrative. I mean, when you were doing these interviews, people weren't burning down police stations during a global pandemic and stuff, right? So that, with like mainly young people out there doing it. I'm not condoning that, by the way. I'm just saying like the height of, from this sort of arc from like Occupy to Bernie campaign to BLM to Me Too to all, there actually has been this like huge surge since you wrote the book in basically a decade of like, I think a lot more kind of collective consciousness around a lot of issues that I think was kind of surprising for all of us, but so I am curious, right, to not throw my entire generation under the bus of like, oh, they've become these just super individualized little units of, like capital accumulation.
And I want to
don't know what they're.
I want to reiterate that like you becoming your own individual unit, like that is like a very smart reaction to the way our society is today, right? If you are someone who didn't come from a wealthy family and maybe you've grown up with experiences of feeling betrayed in institutions that should help you or, unable to climb the ladder, I think it does make a lot of sense to just say, I'm going to focus on my tiny individual sphere and like survive.
Also, maybe to also be fair, to piggyback on that, right? I mean, what if it's also that legitimately that sort of whatever you want to, that neoliberal, like, I don't know, 70s, 80s, like as a sort of New Deal, all the things that were taken for granted, like Harriet always uses this phrase, the white male wage was, if you just happened to be a white guy during like half of the 20th century, early to mid, like you were, there was going to be a house, a car, a wife, some kids, like there was a pension, there's just going to be stuff sitting there waiting for you, you're just going to have stuff kind of.
You get a family wage.
Yeah, you're just going to get stuff. And then so that there was these shifts in that, like, I think the in particular, not just economic changes, there's other societal changes, but there were things that for the millennial generation today, most of those institutions around them actually were kind of collapsing in on themselves. Right.
Yes.
So like, I mean, what were they and what were we supposed to do, right? To look around and just suddenly say, oh, unions are great, when like union density had been sliced to bits.
Decimated.
Like there's almost no such thing as unions anymore. Or say, oh, well, the government will help me out. Well, no, because the welfare state's been gutted too, right? So I think just to kind of validate what you're saying, right? That like, what else was this generation to do
extremely
than to just
risky.
turn inward?
Right. Even to go to college, like the amount of money you have to borrow, the amount of debt you're in, the fact that no one's really advising you on, what a good investment in education is. Like it's just so scary.
And it also may not be a good investment, it's
right. Mm-hmm.
Right. Because there's no guarantee of a job.
Right.
I think there's a lot more discussion about that too. More openly.
It would be interesting.
So I started,
No, please continue.
I was going to say, I started coming up short right at the very beginning of the Great Recession, 2008. So it's sort of interesting to think about and so I also was like, 20 something and on the job market and, watched everything crash. So I think that, we've been through a lot since then.
Yeah, well, I think between 2008's crash, where people had faith in Obama to give hope and change, and he delivered debt and despair, instead, that people were disillusioned and upset. But with the pandemic and our utter failure to take care of our people, we have more dead per population than anyone else in the whole world, at the same time as our economic capitalist system is failing. People started seeing systemic failure. And so it would be hard to blame COVID on yourself, or the recession on yourself. And so I think the consciousness was somewhat shifted. But I wanted to ask you what role you think education has in this, because one of the things that kind of amazed me is Salon magazine is outing a right-wing author, celebrated, who says that how Marxism has failed the American young people. And he talks about the Franklin School. That's pretty stupid. It was the Frankfurt School, he ought to remember, because it's Frankfurt, hello. And how even Marxism in the Franklin School betrayed people. That there's been an allowable ignorance, which I think with Bernie and DSA, and an awareness of what is socialism. In the studies now, a majority of young people prefer socialism to capitalism, even if they haven't defined those things. So how do you see the transition from the individual responsibilities that you corroborated and the change? No.
And I think it also becomes complicated because when, especially for my last book, We're Still Here, most people, as you just said, did believe that the government owed them something. They were sort of proud to think that, my dad used to collect checks from the government for his pension. And, they really believed the government should be there to help or give people a helping hand. And they did believe the system was set up against them and that usually it would come down to money. One really divisive factor, though, was race and racism. And in my work, there may be white working class men who talked a lot about, the government should be for the people, and we are owed something, and we are owed, we should be making more money. How are we supposed to build a life on $9 an hour? But they almost had like a vision of a big safety net, but then they would cut out people like people of color or, immigrants or refugees. And so it's like that last step of how you then like open up that safety net to everyone, I think is where we would get stuck.
Yeah. I haven't ever looked in the statistics, but like that you'll see where you'll get sometimes like lower income white people that seem to be into those, I don't know, welfare state stuff. But like if you inject like a multiracial it depends on who you're talking to,
Yeah.
but sometimes suddenly they're like less stoked about it, or like it just something inside, just like a knee jerk, like an internalized, racism thing, like crops up, and they're like, never mind. I want it for me.
Yeah,
kind of thing.
there's a sense that, they would say to me, well, we're the ones who built America. We're the ones who like broke our bodies doing it. So like, why should I open it up to someone else when I earned this and where, my
you're
own
saying white working class people say that?
Yes. This idea.
That's so funny. That's so funny, because it's like arguably the opposite, I think. But
yes, it
or
is.
not the opposite. It's not an either or either way. But
sort of like serving in the military. That would be how they would.
Sure.
But also,
yeah,
it's the way people are taught now. Now they're in many states. They're calling slavery black immigration. That younger generations really have not been taught about the slaughter of Native Americans and the piles of bones of Native Americans and then Black Americans and then super exploited immigrants on which prosperity flourished here. And I think some of the distrust of the government has worked for the left in that these textbooks and these civics classes in school are crap. If we want to find out, we better get on the internet. And that could lead to conspiracy theories or enlightenment.
Right. Yeah, usually in my work, it's conspiracy theories. And which, of course, often have a note of truth to them. But
of course.
I will say there was also, there is some resentment around affirmative action among working class white people. And it's sort of often, which I think they have kind of a good point where they say, elite educated white people don't really bear the cost of this because, for example, like with busing or school integration, they're like, you just put all your kids in private school. Like you didn't actually suffer from this at all. Or, in your job, like you didn't, feel these effects the way I did. And I think that's where you get the sort of backlash against the elite. So I try to be careful not to sort of frame the left educated as the people who hold the truth, because there's so much classism there and so much elitism.
Yeah,
yes.
Totally.
And there's so much of that within the liberal community. I mean, I don't believe in affirmative action. I believe in subsidy for working class kids according to their background and their money. But I think the system, with a big boost from the CIA and FBI in the early 70s, wanted to convert civil rights into Black power and women's liberation into gender power, not economic liberation for the mass of women. And so race and sex are allowable discussions, subsidized by people like the Rockefeller Foundation. But I think by stressing affirmative action, you are creating class divisions. And you're creating rage from the white working class. And they're right. If class doesn't matter and only race and gender do, then they're really up shit creek without a paddle. And that, class is the most repressed discourse in the United States.
I think a big problem there, right, is that it's such a zero-sum game because the opportunities are so scarce. And so you do imagine there needs to be some big collective movement. At the same time, if you just approach people through class, then and you're not understanding this as something that intersects with race and gender, you're likely to then just reinforce hierarchies of white men.
Right. And the left here has a big responsibility in not saying that class is the staff of the umbrella and the spokes that are united there are race and gender and sexual preference and so on. And so they're either simple-mindedly class determinists or gender or race determinists. And so that there isn't the kind of unity that could change the system.
Well, this to me also goes back to like that individualized, and I wanted to ask you that question about the mood economy. I thought it was such a cool like phrase and concept. I don't know if you made it up or you got it from elsewhere, but that whole, so okay, if institutions everywhere are kind of like the distrust toward institutions from the 70s or whatever up, don't trust the government, unions, school, anything, we're all going into more debt, and then you go inward. I mean, I think that also would kind of support why, because we've been sort of critical of identity certain kind of forms of it, like on the podcast. I mean, we're also like two white people talking crap about things, but that I could see going inward, where however you identify, your identification along certain lines, like as an individual or certain groupings or whatever, would actually become more prominent as well, right? Like if you're not looking for a broader collective, it would be harder to identify on class terms, like and see like class struggle as like a thing. But anyway, I wanted to ask you about the mood economy thing. What's this concept? You have a whole chapter on it, but like what is this? What is that concept of the mood economy? And is it related to millennials being the so-called therapy generation?
Yeah, it's a phrase that I came up with actually with my husband helped me. We were talking about it forever and trying to figure out what was going on. And I was just trying to have a word that could explain what I saw as a shift in both narratives of the self, narratives of what it means to achieve or accomplish something, or what it means to grow. And also that spoke to the sort of capitalistic consumer element of it, where there is an entire economy, devoted to feeling better or wellness that is all about, self-care in the most depoliticized way. Like self-care is, going to the spa, not self-care is joining a union. So trying to understand like that broader shift towards kind of personal care and personal well-being, and the way that it really puts the onus of responsibility on the individual to help themselves, right? People are like, do some deep breathing, not like, have a revolution. And so, trying to like pull out that and then think about the way it overlapped with the sense of people seem to be getting this sense of pride and dignity and accomplishment really through this like narrative of self-change and self-transformation out of pain, rather than through other kinds of more collectively recognized categories.
Did you ever, when you did this, I guess for this book being in like 2013, right? Like, so because like social media, I kind of wonder where things overlap, because I also think of the way social media has emerged as like probably one of the more central ways that people express themselves and even relate socially in a lot of ways for our generation now, where like these, whether it's sort of these images or videos or narratives about my struggle and my trauma. I mean, it's you could just look up and go to any like Instagram or TikTok thing and look and find someone just like really vulnerably sharing about something that I think, again, like past generations would just never openly, they wouldn't like get a public forum and say like, my childhood trauma, I'm stronger today, I fought through it all, yada, yada. And it's like this open thing where it's like potentially 5 million people could see it. And you're saying like, like did that come into play at all for you in this, or did social media not?
So the way I would see it, so Facebook was the most, I think, prominent then, and it was sort of in the earlier days of smartphones, but at the same time,
smartphones, they were like brand new, huh?
Right, that's a great like turning inward mechanism. But the way I guess people would even then use like Facebook as a platform for like almost like a ritual of witnessing, where it's like you're all individualized, but you also need like social recognition that you have done something. And so it was sort of like, let me put my, trauma story or what I've been through story, and then people like it or, empathize or give you support. I think there's probably like so much more of that now with like sharing your story and then feeling connected through that kind of language.
And then through that mood economy idea, because even though you're collapsing kind of the two things of there's that sort of wellness industry component, like there's a sort of outside industry that's to help you on the inside. But then I wonder too, it almost seems like there's a self-branding. We don't need to go too far down the rabbit hole, but and I don't mean to be critical with this, but I do think that it's like you're branding yourself as like, I'm healed. I'm a healed person. I'm a hashtag healed person, or I'm doing lots of therapy, or I'm doing my inner work, or whatever. And then that translating into, I mean, there is like a bigger phenomenon now of ordinary people who've like done, quote unquote, done the work. And now they're like, I'm a coach. I'm going to coach people.
Right. Exactly.
Like
yeah.
that,
I did the hard work, and the hard work is all on the self. I think
and
that's
I'll help you if you, like Venmo me and I'll help you do the hard work. Like I may be uncredentialed, but I did the work. So yeah, the whole economy. I find it really fascinating that it's still, because I think it's still going strong. Even though you wrote this 10 years ago, I think it's still super, it may have like expanded more. I think it's actually grown on some level.
Yeah, I think so too. But I also have a question here, which is that what I see that Reagan began the smashing of the unions with the air traffic controllers, and the transition from big government, which FDR, great big government with its 11 million employees in all these different building situations, and the WPA, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and all the rest. Big government was everybody's loving friend. He was the most popular president in history. And you went from, yes, big government, into Reagan saying that the discontent in your life is not the corporations, it's the government. And yet, I think that helped push people away from looking at a government that could provide and support them, because they're far away from the New Deal by that time. And I think maybe that attitude has been somewhat eroded, and therefore people are joining unions and DSA and the People's Party and climate control and Black Lives Matter and Women's Lives Matter and Me Too and Time's Up, because they are betrayed with that. And I wonder how you look at that transition affecting millennials. It's a lot I asked.
Yeah, I would say, so I was really looking for collective action in most of my work. And one of the major places I saw it was actually in these addiction support recovery groups, actually not with the people who had suffered from the addiction, but from their family members and friends who would gather together to sort of talk about the problems they had, and that was like one of the few spaces where I would see people kind of across generation and across race and gender explaining what they were going through, and also like help each other and think about how to mobilize and share resources. Like, oh, if you need to, help your son apply for, public housing because he can't live with you because you think he'll steal from you, like, think about it this way. Or, we can, try to get this community grant or kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, maybe like this kind of shared experience of pain, which I think often does come out of, betrayal, like does make people think about like what they might be owed and, how to mobilize for it. And I know there was one book by the sociologist Jennifer Randles, and she studied marriage promotion programs in the government. And she found that the low income couples, they didn't actually like learn anything about staying married, but they actually learned that they were all sharing the same problems, and that like maybe they were like structural and systemic. And I thought like that was so interesting to think about spaces where you're talking about emotional pain in marriage and you end up understanding your life in this pattern way.
Yeah. And even though like, I'm personally not the hugest fan of like the hashtag movements I'm just critical of the way like the internet works typically, but I do think that like, Black Lives Matter and Me Too, which like began as hashtag things and have like kind of become much more than hashtags on the internet, are kind of those examples potentially of like what you're saying of it's a sense of very shared pain and trauma. Me Too is like about as direct as you could get. It's like sexual trauma that is something that's just been going on forever anyway. Regardless of what, sort of, system of government, the New Deal coalition, like didn't reduce sexual assaults, I'm sure, like it didn't, help women to to protect
Right.
against those things, right? So like you could just eliminate the sort of economic reductionist stuff. So that is probably an example, right, of this newer generation saying, we're really traumatized, we need a bunch of therapy. By the way, hey, we as women are being sexually assaulted all over the place, and let's just and then with that use of social media, of like the witnessing, like you're saying, let's just, like, all of us sort of as individuals. And I think it was probably an accident, right? Like no one thought this was become like a viral thing. I think same thing with Black Lives Matter, right? There's
Right.
these more publicized like police killings of Black people, and then this hashtag thing happens, and then suddenly there's like, oh, there's this collective shared pain. But then also interestingly, I think George Floyd was probably like the height of it. Even though before that there were more and more white people getting involved, and there was like Surge, which is like a it's like white people showing up for racial justice. More chapters are growing, and then after George Floyd is like the biggest, but more and more people kind of recognizing, I think, through that sense of pain. There's an individual pain and trauma. It's collectivized, and then in many cases, it grows out of the how would you say it? Like the target group, or the group that's experiencing the pain, that others through the witnessing online saying, oh, that's really messed up. We want to help you too. Like we see that you're in pain, right? Like the allyship thing. So yeah, so maybe there is kind of a shift, that's occurring in that way, that it's becoming de-individualized.
I think it is. And also for most working class young men, they've been beaten by the police too. These usually not killed, just badly beaten. But from the working class people with whom I've worked, they get beaten by the police also because they're allowable. Rich kids aren't. And so that I hope and think that maybe this will transfer and people will identify that with that surge, that it isn't an act of charity. It's an act that we need each other to transform this place. And I also think that the 12-step programs are all sharing collective pain as a way of transforming one another. However, they don't allow a political arm. They see that as a cop-out. And yet,
Right.
in the beginning of women's liberation, we got our agenda by having consciousness-raising sessions in which women talked about our lives. And from that, we saw the common problems that were our platform. And that was a social sharing of pain with a political goal. And I hope that can happen also. And I wonder if you think that millennials could bring that dimension, because pain is important and people's psychological well-being is important. But I wonder how you see the possibility of a transition from that pain, individualized, to the realization of collective pain and collective solution.
That's a great question. I often sort of stop at the problems I identify, and then I'm kind of like, oh, okay, how do we do this? It seems to me that there would have to be a lot of work at a very local level, and I think that's because there is a lot of distrust among especially working class people of politicians. So I could see sort of like activism on the ground, trying to like create these kinds of spaces for sharing, and then maybe also, connecting. It seems like a lot of times when people would come together to try to solve problems is when they make these connections. And I do also think that, right, we need like actually trustworthy leaders who really do seem willing to, speak up for the working class, and not just, be another, most of the people I interviewed for my last book would just say, right, left, it doesn't matter. Like nobody cares about me. And I think they're largely right about that.
Yes.
So, also like, how do we, this would have to be really collective to try to think about these leaders.
We'd have to emphasize class rather than just race, sex, and gender, because class actually unites us and would bring everybody together, whereas the others have potential for polarizing us.
And we have to find a way to sort of still understand that, right?
Yes, of course,
sort
we
of
would.
push and pull of privilege and,
Relative privilege.
power.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, one thing I kind of learned a few years ago, I took an IWW, like workplace organizing training, and it kind of like changed how I did like activist stuff. And now I'm really into tenant organizing and kind of have taken those same things. And the sort of key thing, this is like a really, really old method in that frame of organizing. It's just called the one-on-one, where you listen 80%, you talk 20%, and you really just listen to somebody. It's actually the similarities between those organizing methods and like being a therapist are actually quite similar.
Or being a qualitative researcher over here.
I would think so. Absolutely. Cool. But like sometimes, cause you'll just find like, cause like if I'm doing, this is a little bit tangential now, but like if I'm doing some tenant organizing stuff, we're canvassing a building, we're talking to tenants. I mean, I have sort of some class struggle theory in the back of my head. I'm like, I'm this commie going to where the working class is or something like that. But at the end of the day, that's not, people don't see themselves. When you meet someone, they're not like, I'm a member of the working class. And they're not like, I'm a tenant and the landlord's a bastard. They're just like, I am like I'm this like mom trying to feed my kids, or I'm just this guy who has this job and the termites are gross or something. But as you listen to people, I think, and this, I'm trying to maybe segue to not like the solution, but part of the solution is that I think you just have to kind of bridge both worlds of like, we have to kind of know, if we are quote unquote on the left, that there is a need for more collective action and collaboration, and that class has to be an element there, obviously, because it is like, in theory, it's the most unifying, I guess, but to understand that each individual within the class, so to speak, has a totally different way. That's not how they look at it, and they look at it through the lens of their own personal stories, which I think, Jennifer, you've laid out, it's turned into this sort of narrative of individualized pain for the most part. But I think you can sort of like almost Aikido that a little bit and say, okay, here's all your pain, and sort of transfer it to like, well, the landlord's treating you like shit, or the boss is treating you like shit, or those debt collectors, or whatever the institution is of power that does actually have a bunch of power over you and is actually probably betraying you still, that if we work together, we might be able to sort of heal, de-traumatize or whatever. I mean, just to say we might be able to work it out. I found that to be pretty successful. It's just that we need like a lot more of it,
We sure do. But also people are changing in and of themselves. The labor movement is organizing like it hasn't for 50 years. And Richard Trumka is dead. And and he was exactly the opposite of what was needed to unify labor. But people like Sarah Nelson, who's the head of the flight attendants union and was the only person in the labor movement to vociferously call for a general strike when Trump wanted the aircraft workers to work for free. I mean, they are rising. The biggest two militant unions in the United States now are the nurses union, Nurses United women, and the flight attendants women. And so that I don't think it's their vaginas that are determining their politics, but I do think that that leaders are emerging who are women and Black people in a way that haven't, and they will be the leadership, and that is very hopeful. And
maybe there's more trust there too, because like what you were saying, Jennifer, and like the leadership has to not, someone can't be a symbol of betrayal, or like you can't be like, oh well, that person just they sexually assaulted somebody, or they stole money from the union or something like that. So maybe if it's somebody that's part of a collective of shared pain, people will kind of look to leadership and say, okay, I'm cool with that person, I'll get involved. I don't know.
That's a very good point, because at least in New York, with which I'm more familiar because I live here, the progressive candidates elected are women or Black people. And that's very interesting, because that's Jen's explanation of people who are in pain and marginalized, that other people could maybe identify with that because they are super marginalized in our society.
Yeah.
In a publicized way.
Well, We're almost to the top of the hour. I'm wondering if, unless you have anything else, Harry, I don't think I have any more questions for Jennifer. I'm still just gonna I'm gonna have to take a chill pill and go, oh man, got to interview Jennifer Silva. That's so
Oh my
exciting.
gosh, please.
I'm
for
like
me
doing my
personally,
Yeah.
just your book. I now I need to read it. I didn't even know you had the other book, but it just was like, so, it resonated. It like spoke to me in a way that I felt like my life, this is such a millennial thing, I guess to say it. It felt like you like my life had been like written into this book and then collectivized in a way that I thought was individualized. And it was like this,
Wow. Thank you.
I don't know, this brain exploding moment.
I have one more question. I'm much older, and so it didn't hit me exactly that way, but as a kind of fleshing out of the politics I've been considering, in which the mass of people, the low wage workers, are utterly disempowered and cheated. But the question I had was, as these people with whom you spoke saw their families pushing them down rather than helping them up, did any of them question the institution of the nuclear family as a way to raise people?
So there was often still a sense that like the best way would be a nuclear family, but at the same time, as they themselves like went through relationships, also, an understanding of how risky the nuclear family is, especially if it's relying on, men as wage earners and women as caretakers, because it just doesn't really work for lower educated people and the jobs they get. So I do think there was more of a sense of like, maybe it's better to just rely on myself. Like maybe it's too much stress and like too much fallout for me to be going in and out of relationships, and maybe I'm better off on my own.
But a child can't rely on him or itself or themselves.
Yeah.
So it was the child becomes like the most important like part of their lives. And this is like what, Kathy Eden and Maria Kafalis have found as well. But yeah, so the child is really, special and important, but that doesn't mean they can then give the children what they want for their own children to not have like this difficult life either.
Or they don't seem to take it the step further and say, maybe ending up with whoever got knocked up isn't a great plan.
Sometimes, yeah, they do. They understand I think they try to make it work, but then they learn kind of after the baby's born that maybe this is not going to work. But I do think there's always hope for more in a way.
More in what sense? More support?
Like there's always hope that you will find like the person,
the right partner.
The right partner.
So they're still stuck in that paradigm. It's interesting. And I think that is very much part of our culture, that they're stuck in individual family paradigms, even though there's a clear and obvious majority where that isn't working out well for people.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Unless you have to go, actually do one question about conspiracy theories just came to mind. Can I ask you that? Or do you have to go? Okay. So my best friend growing up with who, I haven't talked to him in a long time. And then my dad just passed away, and then he coincidentally emailed me, and I was like, oh, I should talk to him. And I like caught up with him, and he's like, oh, I used my COVID money to buy an RV. Now I'm living in Santa Cruz. And by the way, I wrote the script for this video that my friend made, and I clicked the video, and it was like this 40-minute thing about how gravity doesn't exist as part of part of the Flat Earth Society movement or whatever. And we had I just didn't start laughing, but it sort of occurred to me, because I was like, oh, dude, do I want to get back into talking to him?
Yeah.
Like this is nuts. But I mean, something I've come around to with conspiracy, because I used to be really into conspiracy theories, and then I think
they're you kind of become sometimes, right?
They totally are. Well, also once you become pretty like Marxy, you're like, oh, well, there's the conspiracy theory. It's just the ruling class just like sets shit up so that everybody's kind of like, begging for crumbs and everything falls apart, right? So you don't even need like to make things up. You're just like, that's structurally how it is. But it occurred to me too that, well, he's sort of part of a collective though, right? Like he's part of this collective and like growing movement of people that are saying like the earth is flat, and like there's like, right. So there actually is this sort of community. It's people that I think are, They feel so betrayed by everything around them. And we grew up in like public housing, like Section 8, like kind of grew up on welfare type stuff. And it's like everything around you is garbage. You're being lied to. And then all of a sudden you find this, not just the narratives of conspiracy theories, but then you find other people who also believe the same stuff. And now you're like part of this like community that's this sort of underdog where you're like, well, they all think we're lying and we're crazy, but you know what? Fuck them, because we know what's true. Right? I mean, did you see any of that? Of like, because there is a sort of collectiveness there too.
You will like this next book, because there was sort of a lot of conspiracy theory, and it does have these sort of like radically left like moments in it about the way that the elites are trying to control us and we shouldn't be sheep, and for example, 9/11 and all these wars, it was all about money and using like workers to fight against each other and distract from them making money. Like, so there was like, but then it would, also become, like going down a rabbit hole where you like don't believe in anything anymore. And it really plays into the sense that you have to be on your own to survive. Again, like there is some potential, but it goes into a place that maybe is more likely to head towards either no engagement or like, militia engagement versus more inclusive things.
Yeah, that's nuts. We should do like a whole thing on QAnon or something sometime. We haven't really done
so interesting.
A pod on that yet. Yeah, I think it's super fascinating. I used to feel almost disgusted by it. I was just like, this is so stupid. And then I realized like, well, this is like a religion for people at this point. It's just like, it's like their church.
It's something to belong to.
Exactly. Because like, well, if there's no unions, if there's no this or that, if like
no political party that's left that people can identify with and be part of.
Or or if there's nothing that actually seems like it's nobody's really rooting for you, like you were saying, Jennifer, then it's like, well, but the people that are really telling the truth, like if Alex Jones, these guys that are like telling the actual truth, like they're there for me and I'm there for them, right? I mean, it totally makes sense to me.
So, it's a community.
Yeah.
And cool. Just the way that like maybe educated elites have their own kind of performance of politics in their own community. Like this is like an alternative one where, different things are true. And
I mean, Catherine Liu, I'm a huge fan of Catherine Liu.
I love Catherine Liu.
So, because her thing too, well, she has this like Freudian interpretation where it's like the right now is sort of like the id and I don't know if you know those terms, right? Like the id and the ego.
Oh yeah.
It's sort of like the MSNBC sort of liberal types are like the super ego saying like, oh, that is so stupid. This QAnon craziness, these deplorable Trumpists, they're like this moralizing super ego, but the Trumpy QAnon, whoever people are like this id of they're just going to say, there's no filter. They're like, you can't censor me. I'm going to say, even if it's like racist or sexist or something, I'm just going to say it. And then they're just going to, it's like this, just this like diarrhea mouth, whatever they just are. But there's this denial, like you're saying with the elites, the like coastal liberal university elites, the sort of PMC types that Lou would say, they actually do have more power. They actually are, if you even get a bachelor's degree up to a master's or a PhD and you have all this education, you think you know everything, you're just talking down to these, oh, you stupid QAnon trailer park trash or whatever, like, of course, what do you expect? Like, what do you expect for people to say like, yeah, these liberals and leftists, these cultural Marxists are like out to get me. So I think that's a correct analysis, honestly. So all right. Well, man, I thank you.
Thank you very much.
We totally forgot to.
Well, we have to thank our Patreons and ask people to help us more.
So patrons First Winter, Sarah Turner, Rebecca Johns, Justin Harper, Bandila, Manga, Evan Lee, and Ashley and Liam. You always help us with the editing and social media. You're the man. Thank you for being on the team. Thank you, everybody. Patrons, we love you. If you want to become a patron, patreon.com/It's Not Just in Your Head. We have a little Discord server. It's like a chat room. If you can chat with us, a monthly reading group now. I think we're going to do Fanon this month or next month. And you get early access to episodes if you become a patron. And if you have no money and you don't want to do the patron thing, that's cool too. You can email us and give us feedback, or just, if you want to chat, it's not just in your head @gmail.com.
And also share with all your friends how good we are.
Yeah, or how bad we are. If you don't like it,
Absolutely.
it's just do whatever. And Jennifer, please, what's the name of your newest book? And if there's anything else upcoming or something you're involved in or would like to sort of plug or promote.
The latest one is called We're Still Here, Pain and Politics in the Heart of America. So, it kind of continues on the same themes, thinking about them in different ways in a different time.
Okay, great. I can just look it up, but if you have any like links I can put in the show notes, like a link to the book and the preferred place to buy it and stuff. And that also just like to millennials, other millennials out there, if you're millennial-esque in that range, the Coming Up Short book is like, it's just incredible. It'll be really mind-blowing for you if you read it. You'll be like, wait,
Wow.
Really? I did not know that this is me. So,
thank you so much. You've inspired me to go back to the classroom next week, and maybe people will want to hear me talk. I don't think so.
Maybe. Well, would you say that the pain and the We're Still Here is it like a similar theme? Would you say that it's just sort of piggybacking off the last one, or is it like totally different?
I think it's both. It's also a kind of case study of a small declining coal town in Pennsylvania that has experienced, that used to be very, blue collar Democrats and the coal miners, and now it's like turned all right wing, and then there's been this influx of like Black and Hispanic people, so there's a lot of racial tension, and it just felt like I did the interviews leading up to the 2016 election, so it kind of felt like a little microcosm of America.
Wow, that's incredible. All right, I'm reading that one.
Me too.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you so much,
Jennifer, and thanks.
Thank you so much. It was so much fun talking to you, and I learned a lot.
Same.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.